Over these many decades, I've been able to develop my technical skills as an artist, but I didn't trust my own voice until rather recently. It feels like this is the most authentic way to tell my story, is to be honest. I think people want to think that artists come to New York and they just really make it, or, somebody's this instant success, but it just really isn't that way for a lot of people. And some of that is just having the resources to stay in the game. Like, many artists who come to New York can't financially afford to stick around for that wheel to turn and for their fortunes to change. I don't know. It took me for really a long time, which is kind of pathetic. I feel irritated about it with myself, but maybe it was just necessary to go through this long apprenticeship where I was in New York, seeing a lot of people's work, getting kicked around a lot, casting around a lot. I did a lot of public art. My paintings got made into mosaics from one of the subway stations in New York. This was 30 years ago. Did some things as a result of that. I mean, I've always been around, showing in galleries, like exhibiting my work, doing different aspects of it. But it's only in the last few years that things have just really come together for me. And I think that's often the case, that artists have their own trajectories, and then whether or not they enter the broader dialogue is somewhat out of their hands. I was teaching at Carleton College on a tenure track job. That's in a college in Minnesota, a very good liberal arts college. I was really lucky to have the job. I resigned and just came to New York to live permanently. And that was a big leap, because New York was just coming out of the bankruptcy of the 70s, and it was more affordable, but it was also crummy and dangerous. But it was actually a really great time to be an artist. I mean, I think my father thought I'd lost my mind. He saw me as being a university president, like he was eventually. But I had to really say I could make this jump and leave what had been a really secure future. I had tenure, I could stay there forever, behind, because it was something I just didn't value. It didn't make any difference to me to have that job. It wasn't, that actually I think was a really watershed moment for me, to realize that something that other people valued, coveted, wanted, was of no value to me. It was holding me back. I wanted this world. So the stakes were high for me, because I felt like I'd put all my chips on it. And I started to try and, make my career. I was so disillusioned by the gallery scene and art scene that I had been a part of, that I just almost thought about quitting. I mean, really, it was such a downer. Maybe it's a mid-career thing where you feel like, is this what my life is going to be? The biggest change for me was deciding to buy a building in Bushwick in 2005. That was, for me, kind of a turning my back on the art world in New York that I had become really disenchanted by. I think as an older woman and as somebody who had a certain degree of success but not huge, I just found it a really stratified, uncongenial place, and I was done with it. And so coming out to Bushwick was like a starting over. It was a starting over. And I just became totally immersed in it. And I was one of the leaders of the artists community out there who was looking to make opportunities for artists young and old by doing a lot of DIY stuff. And so I started a gallery called Storefront. I rented a little space in a storefront, like a little 400 square foot space, and started showing other people's work. It was just like very empowering, because mostly as an artist you're squashed and disrespected and you're struggling. But this was like a I think, ever present artists' efforts to take control of their own fate and do things that would help each other. I think a lot of artists are mostly interested in themselves, of course, they should be. But the ethos out there at that time was, let's work together. And the people who got there first, like me, were just completely devoted to that idea. So in helping others, we were helping ourselves. It was like we were creating another power base that we got to be the decision makers for. So everybody wanted to play and participate, and I got to pick which work we would show, and also how to install it. And these are skills I never had. So that actually came back once I stopped doing it to help me in my own work. That experience, retrospectively, I feel was like a huge factor in my developing my own voice, because I developed it as kind of a curator or a gallerist. This is better than this. This is what I want to put with this. I've had a very unusual upbringing. My father was a prominent person in the world. When I was a kid, I mean, he was president of Caltech, so he's a scientist. Then he went to Washington to work for the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. I was very influenced by him, very close to him. But I think it actually held me back a lot, because I have in my life really privileged the intellect through so much of my development, that I think the reason that my work has become, that I've been able to express myself much more effectively in the last few years, is that I finally have thrown off the shackles. I think I wanted to make other people's work. I mean, I think a lot of young artists actually go through that process where you like other people's painting, and I made versions of that for many years, depending on the artists that I was interested in. And I think it just took me a while to realize that the things that surrounded me most immediately and my take on them were what would be the vehicle. And a lot of them are artifacts from my growing up. So there are really big Kachina collectors now. You know, the Hopi Indian Kachina dolls are very valuable and beautiful. Some of them are big and highly ornamented. Mine are kind of shabby and tiny, but they were one of my earliest collections. Like, I was fascinated by them, and I played with them. Like, it had narratives and scenarios with them. So in the painting, it's kind of a way of revisiting this weird impulse that led me to want to have them. Like, one of the paintings in the show has a background of a tapestry that has kind of Chinese elements, a vase and fans. My mother made that. It's a tapestry, a needlepoint tapestry, and she had wonderful taste and had beautiful things, not very valuable necessarily, but things that she'd collected from around the world. And I now have those things, and they are in my environment. She was on her own path. I don't know how she developed her taste to be drawn to these things. I was deeply influenced, I think, by her, like her expression of herself through these means. I mean, she was a very warm and like gentle person, so she connected with people, but she also had this interior life that must have been represented in a way by her interest in these other worlds. And I'm actually it's a mystery to me, that part of her. Like, why did she choose those things? She never talked about it. A dealer came to my studio once, a gallerist, and said, "You have a lot of skill, but I really want to know more what's in your head." When we look at somebody's artwork, we're intrigued by it if there's a certain like mystery and fascination with what world that person comes from and is trying to represent. These are kind of an homage to her in a way, but they're also a way of telling the viewer, this is what's in my head. I was on a path last 10 years to get to this point, but I think the pandemic, those first shadow paintings, I mean, that was a revelation, and the results followed. both in my studio and in the broader world. So I knew I was onto something. So I was in my neighborhood in East Williamsburg, and it's an industrial business zone. So there's a lot of materials-based businesses there. And all of those things were shuttered. I would walk my dog around the neighborhood, and during the winter, I guess, of the end of 2020, early 2021, I saw my shadow, the winter shadow cast down these really long vistas of empty shuttered warehouses, which had a lot of graffiti and murals on them, and her shadow. And I just was struck by that image. I mean, I think artists who work from reality often get inspiration by things that they see that just ambush them, unbidden. They see things that just immediately strike them. And for me, it was, I'm going to paint that this is an image that has so much psychological import in the context of the pandemic and our isolation, and this notion of the shadow as a reflection, as a artifact of you, a protagonist, the person, the individual, the present absence or the absent presence or whatever. I just seemed like so fitting. I took pictures of them on my phone as I walked around the neighborhood, and they just led to this series, which I think people really felt resonated with their own experiences. Often they just sent me images of their own shadows, and sometimes their dog, walking. That happened more than actually people texting me verbal responses. The communication was in the form of, this is my experience too, through an image. Somehow that experience of seeing their shadow during the pandemic was also a reflection of their inner state. I don't think they're only time-stamped with that experience of the pandemic. They clearly came out of it, but I think that maybe it represents a more existential aspect of our being, that really we always are alone in a way. And I mean, I think the paintings have something in common with German expressionism, like Munch or Kirchner, or where you're seeing figures in an urban space, but sometimes they're even crowds, but you feel the isolation of the figures. So I think there's a tradition of that kind of painting that didn't come out of a pandemic, but that my work fits into. And art has to be very specific at the same time and that's the way it becomes universally appealing. It's a total paradox. I think that it's artists who touch people make work from a really specific experience, their experience, and a specific place. And somehow that makes this jump into this, like people sending me images of their experience of the same thing. That was a sign that I was reaching, my very specific images were reaching people and touching them in a universal way. But you can't aspire to that. Or actually, I shouldn't say you can't aspire to it. You can aspire to it, but you can't roadmap that. It's a combination of delving deep into yourself and finding something really specific that you want to say. And then whether it reaches everybody else, that's out of your hands.